across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Wednesday edition of Point of View, and the first hour, going to spend some time trying to make some sense out of some of the things happening in the news, and then we will spend a fair amount of time in our next hour spending some time with Tony Pitaniello as we talk about everything from Bible translation to even the work he's doing right now in the media. Joe Arlinghaus will be with us. We'll talk about Trump and the Pope because he's Catholic, but also talk about what he's doing with Valor America. Very effective pro-life outreach, so we'll get into much of that certainly in the second hour today. First hour, though, I thought for just a minute, I will mention China. We'll get into it in more detail tomorrow, but I thought it would be good to mention a piece that I have posted for Thursday, but it's by our good friend Gordon Chang, who's been in studio with us, even by phone, and he says that this last week, the word has been weak. That is, let me give you a couple quotes here. One of the Hong Kong papers said Trump heads to China weakened as Xi Jinping gains leverage. The editor of The Economist said Donald Trump will be one in the weaker position. And there's a part of me that was going, how are you coming to that conclusion? I recognize that China treats anybody coming over there as a lesser. There's a wonderful quote in this piece by Gordon Chang of an individual that works at a think tank who said, when foreign leaders visit Beijing, they are viewed not as peers, but as a modern equivalence of tribal chieftains arriving to pay tribute. So, yes, Xi Jinping's been acting as if he is the ruler of the world and all the rest. But as Donald Trump pointed out just the other day, in all fairness, 60% of the oil that goes to China comes from the Strait of Hormuz. Guess who controls that right now? If you want to talk about all sorts of leverage, yes, you could maybe say that we are in the midst of a war with Iran, and we were hoping to have a close agreement there, and some people thought maybe they should have postponed the summit, but Donald Trump wasn't going to do that at all, and he has the ability to strike other regime capabilities and bring some broad pressure points to bear on Iran. And again, I've got a commentary coming out next week, but I'll even maybe quote from it tomorrow when we get into this in more detail. China's not in the best of positions. It, for example, got oil from Venezuela. How's that working out for you? It's been getting, of course, as he points out, about 60% of its oil from Iran and other countries through the Strait of Hormuz. How's that working out for them? And then, of course, China, as Gordon Chang points out, is probably more export dependent today than it's been at any point in its history. And of course, we are the primary country to which they export. And all of this is used to say, well, yes, but they might have dominance in rare earths. Well, bottom line, we found more rare earths in some places we didn't expect. Of course, if we have any kind of control over Greenland, which is another whole discussion, that's where rare earths come from as well. So I think a recognition that they may be meeting together and Xi Jinping maybe think he has the upper hand, and probably a lot of the commentators and the legacy press think that we're in a weakened position. I'm not so convinced of that, but I thought I'd mention that. And, of course, by tomorrow, we will know a lot more about what has transpired in China. So we will spend more time talking about that then. So let's see if we can get to some of the articles I've posted. One, which I just thought I'd mention very quickly, is a new bill that has been actually been introduced by Representative Blake Moore. He's a Republican from the state of Utah, which actually is requiring the federal government to implement something they've done in Utah for quite some time, and that is to protect what they call free-range parents. Okay, what's that? Well, if you think about free-range chickens or whatever, those are ones that aren't always in a kennel, if you will, or not in a confined situation. And apparently, because of the way in which we are starting to identify the individuals, especially children that are independent, as possible concerns for CPS, Child Protective Services, this Promoting Childhood Independence and Resilience Act is something that has been used in Utah. They want to actually use that to amend the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act so that essentially law enforcement and child welfare systems wouldn't always be required to investigate parents who allow their kids to partake in some kind of act of independence. Maybe, for example, that they were allowed to walk to the neighbor's home, or they went to the park to play by themselves. For those of you like me that are older, you just sort of have to shake your head. You can well remember, matter of fact, maybe later I'll open up the phones in case some of you want to recount this, of when after breakfast you would say goodbye to mom, you would head out, and your parents, your mom or dad, probably didn't know where you were, might not even know what zip code you were in, and didn't really worry about that until it came time for dinner. Maybe then you'd start looking for them, but probably you would have dropped back for lunch or something of that nature. And so the idea is this. The bill is an attempt to recognize that we should make sure that kids are getting some unstructured playtime. And the bill, in large part, was inspired by Jonathan Haidt's book. I've mentioned him, matter of fact, even yesterday, the book, The Anxious Generation. And he has a nonprofit group called Let Grow, in which he's saying we really just need to have kids get out of indoors, off of screens, go outdoors, really begin to focus on the real world. And I think there is a time, obviously, when Child Protective Services needs to maybe identify children who have very little parental authority and responsibility. But at the same time, the focus here is to recognize that one of the best things we probably can do is go back to a time when kids are getting off screens, they're going outside to play, and parents should certainly provide some oversight and protection. But at the same time, we don't need to investigate every situation in which a child was given some level of independence. And as a matter of fact, the bill would also require that states that pursue grants for child abuse or neglect prevention and treatment programs at the same time do have some place in their particular principles to allow a child to participate in reasonable independence activities without fear or threat of criminal or civil changes and charges. So it's kind of interesting. I didn't really know the term free-range parents. Now maybe you know it as well. But it's a recognition that certainly we have wanted to protect children. Certainly it is important to make sure that if there are predatory factors out there, we protect them from that. But on the other hand, giving children some level of freedom and encouraging them to get off the screens and get outside is probably a very good thing. So we'll follow how the bill goes. I'm sure there'll be some pushback, and we'll certainly cover that as well. But it is our first article today. New House bill would protect free-range parents from neglect investigations. And a little bit later, I might even open the phones, get your comments on that. But it is, I think, a recognition that maybe we've been too overprotective. We need to provide guidance and protection, but at the same time, we need to let kids be kids. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Former Congressman Jason Chaffetz remembers the first time his local grocery store asked him to join their loyalty program. He and his wife declined because they didn't want to give out their information. Slowly, over time, the benefits seemed to outweigh the nebulous risk. Soon they were also getting coupons and even noticed their savings listed at the bottom of their receipt. In his latest books, he calls this the privacy trade-off. You can probably relate. Every day you're probably being asked to submit your information. In many cases, information is being collected from your phone, credit cards, and loyalty cards without you even knowing who has it or what they will do with it. When businesses collect this information, they use it to try to sell you more goods and services. When the government collects this information, they use it in a variety of ways. As someone who writes commentaries and books on social trends, I find the information useful. But there is another side to this data collection. The weaponization of information makes government surveillance much easier. Many in the deep state, often called the administration establishment, collect and weaponize private information. We've also seen how such information is being used by the Chinese Communist Party. We're also beginning to see how it is being used in the European Union. Jason Chaffetz acknowledges that President Trump may be in office, but the deep state continues to collect information. Even if bureaucrats are limited in their power that they exert, they partner with nonprofit and private sector groups who can censor, debank, and prosecute. That is why we need government guardrails that protect our privacy and limit the type of information government can collect. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
One of the things that sometimes we use to determine what are some of the key issues that we should write Outlook articles on in our magazine, create booklets, is to simply look at the number of articles coming out on a particular topic. And if you've been paying attention at all, there are just a lot of articles coming out about capitalism and especially socialism. And we have two of them today related to the idea of, do billionaires deserve the money they have? And also we'll hear from a billionaire saying, we have a city that doesn't seem to appreciate what we've done. And so you kind of get a point counterpoint, although I think you can get a pretty good idea where this is leading. And that is, Rich Lowry has, why does AOC think billionaires can't exist? Well, it turns out that there was a podcast recently in which Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says she doesn't really believe in billionaires. She said in the podcast that she says really it's impossible to make $1 billion without lying, cheating, or in some way or another being dishonest. And she says there's a certain amount of wealth and accumulation that's earned, right? She says you can earn $1 billion, but you can't earn that. You can get market power. You can't break rules. You can abuse labor laws. You can pay people less than what they're worth, but you can't earn that. So again, she'll say, well, you can make that money, but you didn't really earn it. And again, a representative from the state of New York in this particular congressional district makes it sound, as Rich Lowry says, as if our billionaires are the equivalent of Russian oligarchs who got their riches through government favor. And he says, just take a look at maybe some of the wealthiest people. He says, no rational person looks at the top 10 list of wealthiest people in the United States and thinks, what have any of these people done for us? He says it's hard to imagine life without, now he gives you the list, Amazon, Tesla, Google, or Facebook, for example. There's a couple right there that gives you an idea. He says, judging by the list, becoming a billionaire is quite simple. All it requires is unbelievable talent matched to ferocious will and a prodigious executive ability resulting in world-changing business enterprise. The idea that any of the most famous U.S. entrepreneurs got there as though they were maybe stealing from their workers, that it was wage theft, he says, is laughable. The transformative nature of these businesses, he says, is self-evident. He says Jeff Bezos didn't just open up a corner store or department chain. He revolutionized the retail industry, and goes on to talk about the fact that making products available cheaper whether you're thinking about, of course, Walmart or Amazon or anything else. Nobody put a gun to your head. And by the way, most people that have worked at Amazon think that they get paid quite well and they appreciate the benefits that they receive. But nevertheless, he says defending the particular argument of AOC is one where she was trying to clarify later on X, and she says, well, somebody can make $1 billion, but that's different from earning $1 billion. And one of the examples she cited, and so Rich Lowry gets into that, is Airbnb, saying, well, the reason we have high housing prices in America is because of Airbnb, which not true, but we'll leave it at that. He says this is a bizarre accusation to make against a platform that simply allows people who want to rent out their homes or apartments on a short-term basis to connect with people interested in renting them. And again, Airbnb wouldn't be successful if people didn't find them valuable. As a matter of fact, here's the interesting thing. The Washington Post points out that guests spent an astonishing $30 billion on Airbnb rentals in the first quarter of this year, while the company's net income was a relatively small $160 million. 30 billion to 160 million. By the way, New York City, by the way, he says has basically banned Airbnb, and of course it has one of the highest and most expensive real estate markets. So you can see where this doesn't lead very much. But again, the point is the best way to prevent firms from leveraging public policy for their advantage is to have minimal state involvement in our economy, which, of course, is just the opposite of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says. So, again, this is the idea that socialism is good, capitalism is bad. Anybody that makes money, they've got to be dishonest, they've got to be a crook or the rest. Which brings me to my next article, because that's written by Howard Schultz. If you're not familiar, of course, he has been the head of the, now as chairman emeritus of Starbucks, and he explains why he has left Seattle. He says, Washington State has been my home for more than 4 decades. I arrived in Seattle with dreams and ambition, ended up building Starbucks into a company known around the world. But he says, I'm no longer a resident of Washington. My decision to leave has much to do with family choices and my stage of life. Still, I feel a responsibility to speak up about the business and job climate in a city and a state that gave me so many opportunities. And then he reminds us that Washington's economic story is just a kind of a wonderful American story, because it's the place where you had Microsoft, Amazon, Costco, and of course Starbucks as well, and it was in a sense a state that was the global center of technology, innovation, and logistics. And this is a place where entrepreneurs exported their ideas, capital flowed, wages rose, and all the rest. And the civic leadership at the time, though imperfect, at least understood that private enterprise wasn't an adversary of the public good. But enter our socialists. I'll say something about New York City in a minute, but we've already talked about AOC, and we'll get to certainly Zohran Mamdani in a minute. But let's go back to the other socialist, because the mayor of Seattle is Katie Wilson, and she is a Democratic socialist. And he says the ecosystem in Seattle now is fractured. Katie Wilson, the mayor, has chosen to cast business as a foil rather than as a partner. Her socialist rhetoric vilifies employers, even though she continues to rely on them for revenue. She has encouraged residents who disagree with her policies to leave, which, by the way, he did. And he also points out that now, just in addition to Seattle as a city, you have Washington as the state, which he also says, hey, has a broken tax system. Its reliance on sales tax, do you love this? The sales tax is 10.55%. Especially in Seattle, is deeply regressive, because whether you're rich or poor, you pay the sales tax, right? The state needs to rewrite its tax code across the board in a way that ensures people and businesses alike pay their share. He goes on to say that Microsoft and Amazon, once hiring engines, have slowed recruitment and reduced headcounts as they race to build data center capacity and compete locally. Starbucks recently announced it will shift hundreds of corporate roles to Tennessee. Then he points out, finally, that cities and states don't decline overnight. They drift when public safety, fiscal stability, and economic vitality deteriorate. And he says entrepreneurs are accustomed to accountability. If we fail to deliver value, we lose customers. If we misallocate capital, we absorb the loss. But governments should be judged by results, not intentions. But again, he's very concerned about what has happened, not only in the city of Seattle, but in the state of Washington. So he again says, look, leaving doesn't mean abandoning. My family foundation remains invested in Washington's future, seeking to help the next generation achieve economic mobility and prosperity. But that future, he says, is linked to economic growth and job creation. And as he says, as I look across the country, other states are competing for capital and talent by simplifying regulation, reforming tax systems, and investing in workforce development. He says, I hope Washington's leaders will embrace these policies and forge a new compact, one grounded in job creation, sensible taxation, and accountable spending. But you get the sense as you read through the rest of his piece, he's not holding out a great deal of hope. Once again, we can see what is happening in Seattle. And, of course, I might just real quickly mention that Zohran Mamdani has managed to chase just about everybody out of town now because now the latest one to leave is the Apollo Global Management, which has been headquartered in Manhattan, is decided to open a new business hub, which they'll call their second headquarters, either in Florida or in Texas. And, of course, you have also Steve Roth, chairman for NATO Realty Trust, talking about Mamdani as irresponsible and danger. And, of course, we've mentioned before Ken Griffin of Citadel, the last person out of New York City. Turn out the lights. This is what socialism has wrought in some of these cities and some of these states. And if they don't turn it around soon, we really will have a very divided country, just divided economically, if nothing else. And I thought it'd be worth bringing up these ideas right here on Point of View. We'll continue to watch them, and we'll come back with more ideas to talk about right after this.
There are so many big stories happening literally everywhere. So much information, documents released, grand jury testimony, political accusations and claims on all sides. How in the world can any of us keep up? How do we weed out the truly important from the merely sensational? None of us can do it alone. I've been in media for more than 45 years. I've trained my skills, and yet even with that, I am glad for the more than 50-year track record of the team here at Point of View. They help us to cut through the noise and focus on the authentically important. More than that, biblically informed eyes to help us understand and develop ways to respond effectively. Providing what we need takes time and resources, and your partnership makes it all possible. Click on into pointofview.net, hit the donate button, or call 1-800-347-5151. Please give today. Better, sign up and help monthly. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk about my commentary for just a minute. It has the title Privacy Trade-Off, and the reason I use that is there was a book that came out a while back by former member of Congress, Jason Chaffetz, as which he was spending some time talking about how he remembers the first time he went to the grocery store and they asked for information so that he could join their loyalty program. And you've probably had this experience years ago when all of a sudden people wanted all your private private information, and you were thinking, I don't know. So he and his wife declined because they didn't want to give out that information. But over time, they began to say, the benefits seem to outweigh these nebulous risks. And then he started getting coupons and even noticed savings. And in a sense, he calls that the privacy trade-off. Well, some of the privacy trade-off you enter into. The sad reality is a fair amount of it you have no control over. Once we allow the NSA, once we pass things like the Patriot Act and a variety of others, there are more and more cases where, yes, maybe you will voluntarily submit information, but you have no idea where it goes, and information is being collected from you, from your phone, your credit cards, from these loyalty cards and others, and you don't even know who has that information and how they will be using it. And so, of course, when businesses collect that, we sort of like that because, after all, they collect this information so they can sell you more goods and services. And when I go into a bookstore, sometimes I'll get a receipt that said, well, if you like this book, you would like these books. Oh, I hadn't even thought about that. And same thing when you go on Amazon or anything else. But when the government collects these pieces of information, that's a little different. And so if you want to get kind of a preview to my next booklet, it's not coming out next month, but the month after. We're always at least 2 months ahead on this. But eventually, this booklet is on the weaponization of intelligence, or the weaponization of information, however you want to say that. And this is really the other side to the issue of data collection. This weaponization can allow for greater government surveillance, and many in the deep state, or part of the administrative establishment, as it's also called, collect and weaponize that. I just mentioned China a minute ago. If you want to see the worst extremes, that's the Chinese Communist Party, where you're using all the different information that you collected, as well as facial recognition. You get social credit scores. But a lot of that's starting to show up even in places like the European Union, and this is why we're concerned about that. So Jason Chaffetz, former member of Congress, says, look, I acknowledge President Trump's in office, but the deep state is still collecting information. And we, I think, in the last administration learned how quickly that could go the wrong direction and affect individuals, because even if we do find ways to limit the bureaucrats with their power to collect this, they can just simply partner with nonprofit and private sector groups like social media. We saw that under the Biden administration, to censor you, to debank you, to prosecute you. So again, this is a reminder that we are going to have to probably spend more and more time looking at this issue of privacy. Yes, we have a booklet that we've made available in the past on privacy and surveillance, but this one goes a little further into what I call the weaponization of intelligence. And one of the benefits, as I've mentioned before, of being a donor to Point of View is on a regular basis you will receive those booklets. The most recent ones, of course, have been on the Declaration of Independence and the founding of this country. We have one going out right now on the end of civilizations or empires. And then, of course, this one on this whole idea of the weaponization of information and the need for us to make sure that we have guardrails on the collection of information so that you can still retain your privacy. So anyway, that's kind of a look at what we have there today. But let me also, for just a few minutes, talk about a very good piece that was written by Jeff Charles about what John Fetterman is saying to his fellow Democrats. Now, as you've heard us say before, he oftentimes is the odd man out, the one sometimes voice of common sense in the party right now. But recently, he reacted to some of the findings of a poll which documented that a third of Americans believe that the shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner was staged. Now, let me just read from the post on X from Senator John Fetterman, Democrat from Pennsylvania. He says, assassinations plus political violence are real. Then he goes on to say, my party can't be the tinfoil hat brigade. I was there a table away. I promise you this was not staged. Now, why does he say what he says? Well, it's a poll that has come out, and I would encourage you to read this because it just illustrates again that we are starting to see a very significant number of people who on the one hand, I will give them partial credit for not believing everything the government tells you, not believing everything the media tells you. If there's one thing we've encouraged you to do, it's to have some discernment. But these conspiracy theories are off the chart, and I think we used to want to institutionalize people for some of these kinds of beliefs, and nevertheless, here it is. This comes from NewsGuard YouGov poll. So if anything, the poll might even skew left, but I'm pretty sure it's a pretty accurate poll because it revealed that only 38% of adults believe that all 3 assassination attempts against the president were real. Only 38%. Just do the math. That means 62% are convinced that at least one or more aren't. And again, I'll break this down because some of you might say, well, does it break down in terms of party affiliation? Oh, yes, it does, which is exactly why Senator John Fetterman said this. Okay, in total, 21% of Democrats responded they thought all 3 events were staged. 21%. As did 11% of independents and 3% of Republicans. It takes a lot to think that Butler, Pennsylvania, the one at the golf course, and the White House Correspondents' Dinner, all 3 of those were staged, and you can get 21% of Democrats and another 11% of independents. So you add that up, pretty significant number. Now, again, of the 12% who said that all 3 attempts were staged, 55% of them were Democrats, 38% were independents, and 7% are Republicans. And of the respondents who said all 3 were authentic, only 15% were Democrats, 38% were independents, and 47% were Republicans. So even there, trying to just even come up with a majority that would actually believe that they were authentic, you can't come up with a majority of Americans. And for the most recent event, which is what happened on April 25th, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, 34% of Democrats and 13% of Republicans said it was staged, which is a 21-point gap. But again, it is concerning that you can get a third of Democrats who, when we have the visuals, we have individuals who were people in the press who saw this and were there that night. I think if there were any members of the White House Correspondents' Press Corps that had any doubts about them before, this one probably got their attention. And so again, researchers found that for each attempted assassination, a majority of Americans said either they were staged or that they were not sure, averaging 54% across all 3. However, the author stressed that there is no evidence that any of the attempted assassinations of Trump were staged. This is from the pollsters, and emphasized that in each case, authorities reported the suspects acted alone and were not tied to the Trump administration. It's amazing you even have to say that, but I bring this article to you to recognize that now, at least, we have John Fetterman. I'm hoping and even praying that we'll have some other Democratic leaders that say, we need to stop this. But again, going back to John Fetterman, senator from Pennsylvania, nevertheless, a Democrat saying, my party can't be the tinfoil hat brigade. I was there at a table away, and I promise you this was not staged. And this, I think, illustrates again that at a time when conspiracies are running rampant, I think there's going to be more and more of a need to begin to crush them and to stamp them out. And I come back to an individual that we've had on the program over the years, Michael Medved. When he had his radio show, he used to do a conspiracy hour. And I used to think, when I would sometimes listen to this, should I even bother listening to this? And I would listen to it for a while, and I was thinking, how in the world can you come up with an hour's worth of material? And then as he began to get into it, I'm going, yeah, I mean, it's almost like a cottage industry. Just unbelievable, the number of people that are willing to believe one conspiracy after another. And I would have to say that John Fetterman is saying to his fellow Democrats, you're just not healthy. This is not helpful, and it is not the way I would like to be associated with other members of the Democratic Party. Anyway, I've posted the article for you to read. It's a head shaker, but I thought you'd like to know about it, and we'll be back right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me just mention as a program note that tomorrow, going to spend some time talking with our good friend George Barna. Been wanting to get to this interview because for some time we've heard some evidence of there being a little bit of an uptick for spiritual interest on the part of Gen Z. But the bottom line is it's not as maybe significant as reported. So George Barna really helps us understand both the spiritual progress and regress of Gen Z. So we're going to spend some time talking with him. Barry McGuire going to be with us as we talk about trying to ignite America's mission, which is something I'll be talking about in just a few minutes, in part with Tony Pitaniello in the second hour. And then we're going to get into, of course, China. Gordon Chang, I mentioned today. We'll get into this whole idea of democratic socialists. Noah Rothman, democratic socialists need a new model. I love that one. John Stossel has a new piece out on capitalism, the thing that works. And Byron York coming back to something we just talked about a minute ago with Senator John Fetterman, the Democratic Fantasy Land. So there's some really great material that we're going to cover tomorrow. Friday's our weekend edition, so I hope you'll join us then. In just a few minutes, we'll also be talking about, in the next hour, Joseph Arlinghaus. We'll be talking about, of course, his excellent organization called Valor America. But because he's Catholic, I thought he would be good to speak again to this issue of the conflict between the president and the Pope. We've already had Paul Kenger talk about this. And here, my last piece before we get to their interviews next hour is a piece by Cal Thomas, When the Pope Isn't Right. Now, Cal Thomas is a Protestant, whereas the two other guests that we've had are Catholic, but I think he helps us recognize that there are some issues that need to be discussed as well. Cal Thomas says it must have been a highlight for any Roman Catholic to meet the head of his church, so it must have been last week for Senator and now Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a practicing Catholic. And Marco Rubio was there in some respects to try to present the Trump administration's views. And Cal Thomas says, look, the Pope is committed to resolving disputes through diplomacy. That course would be worth pursuing if Iran's leaders and the U.S. had even remotely similar goals in mind. He says just as Catholics and Protestants differ in their theology, Islamists differ with just about everyone else, whether they be religious or secular. They differ from everyone else because their goal is world domination. And then he gives a quote from Winston Churchill that talks about back even more than a century ago, some of the attributes of the Muslim faith at that time. And he says the problem is that the current Pope, Pope Leo, either doesn't fully understand or believes his interpretation of good, that is, diplomacy, can triumph over evil. History and common sense are full examples to the contrary. There is a real need, I think, sometimes to recognize, as much as we would like to solve any kind of international tension with diplomacy, the reality is sometimes it doesn't work. Cal Thomas uses this illustration. You can't win at card games or sporting contests if one side plays by the rules and the other cheats. How does diplomacy dissuade an Ayatollah regime from murdering its own people? So then he gives a little bit of history, and the one that he uses I thought was most helpful. When Ronald Reagan called the Soviet Union an evil empire before the 1983 gathering of the National Association of Evangelicals, the secular world, he says, was stunned, and we reported that back then. His speechwriters tried numerous times to get him to remove the label from his speech. Each time, Reagan refused. He knew that he was right, and when asked by a reporter what his goal was in dealing with the Soviets, Reagan responded, "We win, they lose." And he says this is the kind of clear-headed thinking President Trump is demonstrating against Iran. He says when confronting evil, the only successful approach is to make the evil side fear the good side. For decades, the Ayatollahs have lied, murdered, or cheated on agreements directly and through their proxies. The only way to eliminate their threat and to stop them from killing more innocents is not through diplomacy, but through strength and not quitting before the goal is reached. If the Pope doesn't get that, he invites more evil from the Ayatollah regime. You know, we sometimes talk about this idea of peace through strength, but there is some truth to that. I know it's been vilified by various individuals, but there are times when you are dealing with an evil empire. And I come back to the piece just a minute ago that we had from Gordon Chang, because right now Xi Jinping really hasn't even tried to be very respectful. The other day, he actually allowed his commerce ministry to invoke the country's anti-sanction law for the first time, ordering Chinese entities not to comply with U.S. Treasury sanctions on a number of different issues, and as a result, treating almost anybody that shows up, in this particular case, as this one individual says, not as peers, but as tribal chieftains here to pay tribute. And so in some respects, we can only keep a country like China in check because they are a nuclear power. We can only do so much with Russia because they're a nuclear power. But it brings us back to why we did not want Iran to be a nuclear power. And in some respects, this idea that we can in some way have a diplomatic negotiation that would change the kind of ideas that we have seen promoted in Iran, I think is a fool's errand. And so if nothing else, Cal Thomas has some perspective on that. In just a little bit next hour, we'll talk with Joe Arlinghaus and get his perspective from a Catholic point of view, an individual that is a Roman Catholic and actually has studied political philosophy at the University of Dallas and really can maybe bring some perspective, as we've already heard from a number of other individuals as well. But just before we take a break, I did mention real quickly some of the resources we want to put in your hands. Let me talk about one that is free. I'll hold this one up for those of you watching online. This is a free booklet that we've been making available. It's the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. It was something that we've been talking about quite often as we've been focusing on America 250. So this booklet is free. And it is something you can get by simply going to the website pointofview.net. Click on that button that says get your free booklet. We have an opportunity for you to get a free download, or more importantly, I'd really want to encourage you to give us your address so we can send you this booklet, and it's absolutely free. In a couple of weeks, we're going to be coming to our fiscal year end, and sometimes when we do that, we remind you that if you can help us financially, that would be appreciated. But during our Truth Team, we also mentioned the fact that for your particular gift monthly, you receive some tremendous benefits, not the least of which is the Outlook magazine. But for as little as $1 a day or $30 a month or more, you receive these booklets, and I'll hold up the most recent ones. I mentioned the Declaration of Independence, which came out in April, the Biblical View on America's Founding, which has come out here in May, and just about now you should be getting in your mailbox this one, A Biblical Point of View on Why Empires Fall. And those are just a few. Of course, I gave you a preview a minute ago of one that will be coming out a little bit later. And these are resources, again, we want to put in your hands. And so, again, I hope that some of you will consider what you might do, even as we get closer to our fiscal year end, to consider maybe supporting this ministry on a regular basis. We know that most of the individuals that have listened to this program have never given even one gift to this ministry. And if you're one of those individuals, but you've been benefiting from all the resources we are making available to you, I might encourage you to consider what you might do to support this ministry. But again, you can go to the website and get the free booklet. My Viewpoints commentary today is on privacy trade. And if you want to like to sign up to get my commentaries on a regular basis, you can click on that button as well. But there are some great resources. We'd love to get them to you. We're going to take a break, come back with more right after this.
Who can you trust? Years ago, many of us could probably have provided a fairly long list, but today it seems we almost can't trust anyone. Educators don't even know what a woman is anymore. Many so-called public servants have shown all they care about is themselves. The FBI has been accused of bias, law-breaking, betrayal, and journalism. It's largely corrupt, with no Clark Kent standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. All of this is why Point of View Radio is more important than ever, and your part in supporting us is more needed than ever. Do your part today in supporting trustworthy truth. Stand with us and help push back the lies and the darkness. Visit pointofview.net. Don't put it off. Take a moment right now and click on that big blue button that says Donate Now, or call to invest at 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net, and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, going to spend some time talking with a couple of individuals that I think you need to know about. One of those is Tony Pitaniello, who is an individual that has been involved in ministry for more than 2 decades and is certainly wanting to do what he can to have a great impact on the kingdom. He currently serves as the encouragement ambassador for Encouragement Media Group. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. But one of the other reasons, and probably the major reason I wanted to get him on, is the other day I heard him speak once again about something I know he's been involved with. He's been a catalyst for global Bible translation and has been one of those individuals that has seen how, in some respects, that is really taking off, and I think it would be a real encouragement to you. Served for a while as the Chief Development Officer for Word for the World, and also had worked with the Seed Company. We've interviewed some of those individuals in the past. Before that, even had spent 15 years in Cambodia as the country director for the International Mission Board, and it is a delight, Tony, to welcome you to Point of View.
Kerby, what a privilege and pleasure it is to be on your show.
I do want to talk about translations. Well, let's talk about Encouragement Media for just a minute, because if nothing else, it's like old home week. I mean, Troy Creekbaum is the president. Bill Bumpus, who I've known from KCBI, vice president of programming, one of the on-air hosts, Linda Stringer. I mean, it's a veritable who's who of people that I've known from Christian media, especially a good number of them from KCBI, and here they are working right now in Encouragement Media Group. Can you tell us more about that?
Wow, you really named a lot of names. Those are some of our key people. And yes, Encouragement Media Group still going strong in English broadcasts. But one of our newest things was we bought a Dallas station where we're going to have 2.5 million Hispanic souls under signal.
I think that is, was it Moldavita, I think is the one you're talking about?
And, well, Moldavita is our teaching station. Fusion is our music station. We bought KZMJ. And we have 18 signals like that around the U.S. that have a 94% listener rate and then an 84% referral rate to others, whether they're in the U.S. of our apps, Fusion and Moldavita, or overseas, where Peru, Colombia, Mexico, you name it.
That's just incredible. By the way, next time I see you, I should give you a copy of a few of my books, which are in Spanish, which we've actually had an individual translating some of those. And if that would be helpful to any of the on-air hosts, be glad to do so. But I wanted people to know about that, and we do have a link there. So if people would like to know more about that particular media group. And most importantly, though, the other day, Abigail was actually inviting you to come to speak to all of the groups at the Hope Center. And you were talking talking about Bible translation. And I thought, as great as it was for, I don't know, almost 50 people to hear that in the group, I think it would be good for people on 200 radio stations to hear that, because you've been seeing how Bible translation has really been taking off. Can you give us some perspective?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, the theme when Abigail asked me to speak was unity and collaboration. And the Bible translation movement has really exemplified that. You have a number of organizations that instead of competing or overlapping, they're combining and collaborating efforts to reach the Bible list. So most people may not know that there's 7,395 languages in the world. And 10 years ago, when I joined the Bible translation movement, I think it was over 3,000 that hadn't been touched. But thanks to God's working and God's people unifying and collaborating around a wonderful cause and purpose, as of April, and the number will be lower in May, they haven't released it yet, there's about 473 left that haven't been touched out of those 7,395 languages.
Isn't that incredible? And again, there are all sorts of reasons for that. You remember the old days, because having been in Cambodia, I'm sure you've experienced it, where somebody with the Wycliffe, or of course now Seed Company, a variety of others, would go and live among the individuals. They would learn the culture. They would learn the language. It would be a long and tedious process. And at the end, then we would see at least a New Testament that was in that particular language. And so many of these were unreached people groups. But it seems to me that modern technology, that's computers, that's voice to text, that's AI, and a variety of others, have been able to speed up the process, don't you think?
Oh, it's been incredible. It used to be about 40 years to finish a New Testament, and sometimes, if they weren't careful, it might be in book form and just sit there and not get used. So they've focused on speeding it up, as well as making it available in formats that they will use, maybe audio recordings or oral Bible translation. With all the technology you just mentioned, in low-resource languages where AI is hung up a little bit because there's not enough data to put into it except from the translator's minds, we're looking at a whole Bible in less than 12 years.
Wow. It's just amazing. One of the illustrations I've used around our table when we were hearing you speak is that if you ever go to the Museum of the Bible, and you know what I'm going to be talking about there, there's a room where they have all the Bible translations, and it has been interesting to go in there and pull off a Bible and say, well, I didn't know we had even something in that language, much less an entire Bible. But you also have some sort of dummy copies there, and it seems to me that that number has moved from 3,000 to about 470. And that is incredibly good news, and just a testimony again to what is happening in the whole area of Bible translation.
Yeah, praise God for that. Unity, collaboration, the Spirit moves in those things. And, you know, we have to decide who shouldn't get the Bible, should be our question. And really no one shouldn't get the Bible.
And again, we're going to take a break, but when we come back, I thought maybe you give us a perspective, too, on those numbers, because we're now getting down to smaller and smaller numbers. So there has always been this idea that maybe the Lord would return when the word is preached to the entire world, and yet we still have some unreached people groups. We still have some individuals that have never heard the name Jesus, never actually been able to read the Bible in their language. So I thought I'd give you a chance to kind of explain a little bit more what that looks like. And most importantly, I'd be remiss if I did not talk to an individual that has worked all these years in fundraising and in the various aspects of service, because that, I think, brings us back to the need for us to support these ministries and these organizations, ones that you used to work with in the past and those which are still out there making a difference. So I did want to give people a chance to know a little bit more about this whole idea, and also get to know you as well. And for people to realize that we also have a link to this idea of outreach not only to, of course, the English-speaking world, but also the Spanish-speaking world, and now how AI and artificial intelligence has made that even more successful in terms of actually being able to have almost instantaneous translation of videos and things of that nature. So let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation talking with Tony. Let me also open up the phones. I suspect maybe up until now you've had some questions about some of the things we've covered. If you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Talking about Bible translation and really making a kingdom impact. We'll continue that conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Former Congressman Jason Chaffetz remembers the first time his local grocery store asked him to join their loyalty program. He and his wife declined because they didn't want to give out their information. Slowly, over time, the benefits seemed to outweigh the nebulous risk. Soon they were also getting coupons and even noticed their savings listed at the bottom of their receipt. In his latest books, he calls this the privacy trade-off. You can probably relate. Every day you're probably being asked to submit your information. In many cases, information is being collected from your phone, credit cards, and loyalty cards without you even knowing who has it or what they would do with it. When businesses collect this information, they use it to try to sell you more goods and services. When the government collects this information, they use it in a variety of ways. As someone who writes commentaries and books on social trends, I find the information useful. But there is another side to this data collection. The weaponization of information makes government surveillance much easier. Many in the deep state, often called the administration establishment, collect and weaponize private information. We've also seen how such information is being used by the Chinese Communist Party. We're also beginning to see how it is being used in the European Union. Jason Chaffetz acknowledges that President Trump may be in office, but the deep state continues to collect information. Even if bureaucrats are limited in their power that they exert, they partner with nonprofit and private sector groups who can censor, debank, and prosecute. That is why we need government guardrails that protect our privacy and limit the type of information government can collect. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation with Tony Pitaniello as we are focusing for a moment, more or least, on this issue of Bible translation. Mentioned Word for the World, Seed Company. Of course, I mentioned Wycliffe and some of the others. And Tony, it does seem to me that this has been just kind of a new emphasis on technology because, as you point out, how long and tedious it was to make of translation available in a particular group. Now it seems to be speeding up, and the good news is that, as you know, you can travel anywhere around the world, and people have a smartphone, and they may not have all the latest technology, but they have the ability to read or to hear that particular part of God's Word in their language, either the New Testament or the entire Bible. And so this is just kind of a new day. And as an individual who's been raising funds, in some respects, I think that probably makes your job a little easier, doesn't it?
That's great perspective, as usual. I want to say YouVersion, the Bible app, is one of the key partners. They post every translation that's done in the Bible translation movement. And in restricted countries, people could be at a coffee shop reading their Bible and no one knows what they're reading. And for in America, we can also use that Bible app, and we can have the Bible read to us in any one of multiple English versions. So it's really that's actually a key piece of the Bible translation movement is Life Church and YouVersion. They should be mentioned as well.
Well, let's talk about how we could use that right here, because you've been a missionary. You were called to be a missionary. You went overseas. But, mission work can just happen at your local Starbucks. I mentioned Starbucks last hour because you can run into individuals that come here. And I've run into individuals, for example, and I want to show them the Jesus film. And I said, well, just tell me what language. Okay, here we got that one. We can put it on a DVD. Oh, you like a Bible in your language? Well, here we go. Here, and of course, you just mentioned that. And it does seem to me that whereas before we had to go on a boat in the old days or on an airplane, and in the old days of having a pith helmet and a passport and living there forever, and now in some respects the world is coming to us and we can be involved in international ministries right in our own community, can't we?
Oh, 100%. I can't tell you how many Uber drivers that spoke another language and maybe some broken English that I've airdropped the Bible app with their language called up on it so they could, and they'd say, wow, that is my language. And they could read the Bible. It was open right to John 3:16 when I sent it to them, or another relevant passage for what we talked about. It's so easy nowadays to share our faith.
So let's see if we can talk about how people can support that ministry. I mean, I know you don't necessarily work for any of these groups now, but you have. And it does seem to me that if people are saying, well, you're only down to about 473 left, well, but I think in that respect, that's why we really need to mobilize people to see this as a very significant way to reach out to the rest of the world and to get into those unreached people groups sometimes for the first time.
Exactly. No, that's a great point. The donors out there that I call investors, because they're investing their hard-earned money and the wealth that they gained with their talents and their brains into eternal rewards and eternal impact. And so any one of those Bible translation orgs, if someone was to just even Google, Bible translation worldwide, they'd come up with any one of those orgs or Illuminations or YouVersion. And giving to any of those is helping ensure that Bible poverty is alleviated, that people are hearing God speak to them in their mother tongue, the language their mother used when she held them, and that they're able to relate to God via Bible passages.
Just incredible. Again, this is a great opportunity for people to be involved in that. And for just a minute, talk to maybe people that are interested in missions, maybe the mission pastor or something of that nature. Of course, you went with International Mission Board, but it does seem to me that if we really want to talk about reaching the world for Christ, one very strategic part of that is Bible translation and then distribution of those Bibles to those key individuals. And it does seem to me that this is something that maybe needs to be front and center, maybe even at some of these mission conferences, and even some of the things that maybe the mission pastor would address to the congregation.
Yes, exactly. I think if a mission pastor or a pastor were to say, I hope you're enjoying today's sermon and what you're reading. Do you realize we actually have a tool called the Blank Bible, and we'll hold it up in churches and we'll have somebody hand it to somebody and say, would you read John 3:16? And they'll look and it's blank pages. And we can say, that's somebody's Bible in the world. In other words, there's nothing in it.
Yes.
And should that be, is that not a travesty? And how can our church get involved? There's multiple ways. You mentioned IMB. They're working in those realms. I think every mission sending agency has a component of either they're going to distribute, or they're going to use an existing version, or they're using solar-powered proclaimers from Faith Comes by Hearing. The thing is, we got to remember we're all one team. There really shouldn't be any competition or territorialism. We really are the kingdom. We really want people to have what we have, which is the best thing we could have, which is eternal life begins now. And it begins by knowing him through his word.
Just before I let you go, I did want to also talk about, again, what you're doing through Media Group, because this is a great opportunity to reach out. In just a few minutes, we're going to be talking with Joe Arlinghaus about some of the outreach he's had to Hispanic voters. But here you have an opportunity to reach out to people in their native language, which is Spanish. And if you travel anywhere in Latin America, you recognize, with the exception maybe Brazil, which is Portuguese, everything else is Spanish. And what a great and untapped mission field right in our own hemisphere. And again, as an individual raising funds for that, what would you encourage individuals to do? Because there's a place when you go to the link that we have there for people to learn about the stations, to know how to donate. Of course, if they click on the picture there of you, we have a link to a couple of things, your Facebook link and all sorts of other things, the website. So if people would want to contact you, or if people wanted to know more about the Media Group, give us a little bit of an overview.
No, I love that opportunity. When you think about the last mile of delivery of electricity or water, it's usually the most difficult mile, to bring it to every faucet, to bring it to every outlet. Our radio station, with 94% listenership and 84% referral rate, is mouth to ear, last mile of delivery of uplifting Christian music, the gospel, and Christian teaching, and we're driving Hispanics to church all over the world. So we have a shot at all 600 million Hispanics worldwide. And not only that, they're a gateway people. They're the fourth most spoken language in the world, and a gateway people to the populations out there that a lot of Americans can't go to.
Well, again, I believe in that, because a good number of my books are in Spanish, and we've made that available. I attend a church where, of course, we have, I think now they say, maybe the largest Spanish congregation in North America. So those are very great opportunities. But if nothing else, we have a link to encouragementmediagroup.com. So if you'd like to know more about Tony, you can click on the picture there, and that will take you to his Facebook page. If you'd like to know more about the group that he's involved with and some of the other great people that I've known for literally decades. All of that is available at our website at pointofview.net. And so, Tony, I know you're a busy guy, but I figured if I could prevail on you to just maybe share a few of those great insights about the importance of Bible translation, it would be a real encouragement to our listeners. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you for all you do for the kingdom, for the Word of God, and for our country.
Going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some of these other issues. Let me just mention, though, just thinking about this, you had about 3,000 languages untouched, and we're getting it down to 400 plus. That is encouragement, and I think it would be a reason for you to consider what you might do as well. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, Joe Arlinghaus is with us. I, first of all, of course, wanted to get some thoughts on his perspective about, as a Roman Catholic, what about Trump and the Pope? This is something we've covered before, and even we posted today a very good piece, I think, by Cal Thomas, but I'd like to get his thoughts on that. But also, as I mentioned just a minute ago, he is with Valor America, and the Valor America team has really been the most successful so far in reaching out to a number of individuals, especially with kind of the pro-life message, and I think that's going to be important. As a matter of fact, on our Friday conversation, we already have one article that talks about how some of the Hispanic voters are kind of leaving, if you will, the Trump orbit and the Republican orbit, and so that, I think, is going to be important to know what is being done behind the scenes to reach out to some of these individuals as well. So we're going to come back and at least get two very important points from him, individual we've known for many years. And again, if you would like to know more about some of these guests that we are talking about, you can find all of it at our website, pointofview.net. I'll be right back.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Next guest is Joe Arlinghaus, who again is running a project which is known as Valor America Super PAC, and I want to get into that first and talk about the fact that it's been just a very effective pro-life federal election outreach, and Newt Gingrich said it was the first conservative effort to master the science of data and experimentation. Very well done, and we'll talk about that, as well as we were talking just a few minutes ago with Tony Pitaniello about reaching out to the Hispanic community. Their team ran the most successful outreach to Hispanic voters, so we'll get into that. But also did want to talk with Joe about the issue of President Trump and the Pope. We've had some conversations about that. Even today, of course, I posted a piece by Cal Thomas, but also a while back we've had another Catholic address this issue. And again, he is an individual that comes from a Catholic background and has studied political philosophy at the University of Dallas. And Joe, welcome back to Point of View.
Kerby, it's great to hear your voice. I'm so grateful to be here.
By the way, didn't I read recently that you had emergency surgery because of appendix or something of that nature? So,
well, it pleases me that you're reading emails from my team. But yes, I'm good now. I actually had 3 surgeries. The first one saved my life, but it took a couple more to fix everything the right way. I had a bad surgeon to start and a great one to finish. So I'm in good shape now, though.
Okay, well, still encourage people to pray for you because I did see that and I was amazed. But before we get, of course, to the whole issue of Trump and the Pope, I thought for just a minute, let's re-educate our listeners about Valor America, because this has been such a successful outreach. And in fact, we're in the midterms, and people saying, what about the Hispanic voter? And we even have a piece coming out on Friday where some people are saying, well, some of those people have moved away from the orbit, and that does not bode well for pro-life Republicans. So talk about what you're doing to try to make sure that you get that message out to so many individuals in this country.
Yeah, thanks, Kerby. You know, we stumbled onto the kind of revolution that happened in the Democratic election world about 20 years ago, where they developed much more effective ways of determining the version of a message that was most persuasive. And we all know about their first big foray into this. It was that whole war on women attack they made back in 2012. We all remember, Mitt Romney was sitting there just, with his eyes wide open, not realizing when George Stephanopoulos said, hey, do you want women barefoot and pregnant and to ban contraception? And, Mitt had no concept that this was literally being fed to Stephanopoulos by smart scientists. Well, so I stumbled onto this back in 2014, did a giant pro-life effort in Texas that moved about 18% of Hispanics from Democratic voting to Republican. It was a race for governor. It was a big success. But for me, it was more about figuring out that there are methods that our enemies, our opponents, I don't like the word enemy, but opponents use to try to manipulate our voters to come their way. Well, it's not. I don't like the word manipulation, though that's really what they're doing. Really what I tell people is if you can find the right wording of the truth that the listener will understand. So in our case back then, it was telling Hispanics that this party, the Democratic Party, that they thought loved the poor and cared about, food for children and schooling for little kids and all that, was in fact the party that wanted to rip babies from their mother's womb, like Trump said. And we were able to shock them enough that they said, what on earth? What am I doing voting for those guys? And so we're constantly looking in lots of races. It's not always Hispanics, although that is really an area. There is so much, lack of sophisticated political knowledge in that community. I'm talking about Hispanic citizens, of course. Sure. But most of these are, second generation or third generation people who are just barely integrated into our culture. And in fact, to talk to them, because they do kind of live in a subculture where they tend to still speak Spanish, you not only have to find the right wording, but you have to talk to them in a language they understand. You've got to talk to them in the right accent. So it's sometimes you got a little gringa girl speaking her high school Spanish. Well, that doesn't persuade. But then if you get a nice Mexico City accent, they go, oh, this is one of my friends. This is one of my community. So I can listen to that truth. So we've searched for through peculiar experiments. We search for the best way to tell the truth, the best message, the most persuasive message, and then we target it. It might be Hispanics, it might be black voters, it might be working class whites, it can be whomever, but we look for that community in this state or that state who's most open to conversion. That's what we're doing. It's political conversion, but it's still a big deal to make that conversion.
Very well done. Again, we have a link to valoramerica.org. 3 million voter targets in 6 states. Already counting down 134 days to November 5th. So, again, some of the revolutionary data science. And if you'd like to know more, that is on the website, pointofview.net. But I know that you have been interviewed on this whole issue of President Trump and the Pope. Yes. And I'd love to get your thoughts because I've tried to give people a platform to hear how that has gone and maybe to get some perspective. So share with us some of the things you've been talking about on other radio shows.
Yes, Kerby. I think there's 2 things that we Christians need to understand. The first one is that even though this is 2 men who have their opinions, it starts with a lot of people who are not our friends, not friends of Catholics, not friends of Protestants, not friends of Jews, who are trying to stir up this. So we always have to wonder, what is the other side doing to divide us? It's at the end of the day, of course, it's the evil one himself that is the great divider.
Right.
And there's something in this that we should always be worried about. Now, my first reaction just on the human side of the argument is these are both big boys. They're both world leaders on some level. Obviously, one of them, the leader of the world in civic affairs. But they can handle a little bit of criticism. When I listen to some of my Catholic friends get all hot and bothered that, how dare anyone criticize the Pope? I think, well, sorry, if that's your version of Catholicism, no, pastors, priests, bishops, popes, they're not always to be listened to and treated with kid gloves. No, sometimes even within Orthodox Catholicism, it is entirely appropriate to call out foolish comments. And of course, our president is not a Roman Catholic. There's no chance of holding him to the same standard maybe I'd hold myself to. But also, I think his words were really inspired more by some liberal American bishops. There's 3 dudes who went on 60 Minutes.
Yes, that's right.
Ago,
yeah,
who are not faithful Catholic men. I mean, I hate to tear down my own tribe too much, but these 3 are highly political folks. They're boomers from the 60s who are, at the end of their time as bishops, thank goodness. And they're not just fighting Trump, but they're fighting something that's happening in American Catholicism that I'm sure most evangelicals wouldn't know about, which is a tremendous movement, especially among young Catholics, toward a traditionalism, an orthodoxy in doctrine, and a cultural conservatism. You know, when I was a kid, I'm 55. When I was a kid, the typical priest was a foolish Democrat, and in fact, sadly, some of them were saying things that are so against the moral life of the Gospels. But today, the typical priest is, in America at least, is quite different. He is deeply committed to the Scriptures. He is very culturally conservative. He's pro-life to the core, and he may be a little bit politically disinterested because he's focused more on theology than politics. But insofar as he is politically active, he's almost certainly a Republican. Their latest polls show priests under 40 are 80% Republican.
I did not know that.
So this world, and those are the people talking to me, talking to the people younger than me, my children. This is it scares these old liberal bishops. So anyway, I just say that's something going on behind the scenes. But you know, I think the Pope also stepped in it in a couple of ways. I read Cal Thomas's article this morning, and you know, I think it's very polite and kind to everyone involved. But truly, I don't mind, of course, pastors, even the chief Catholic pastor, saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers." My Lord, of course, we should hear those words, and I think it's an important reminder anytime we're involved in conflict, anytime we're involved in the killing of war, to really dwell on,
sure,
are we where we should be? Are we going too far? But of course, to say that all war is wrong would be not only foolish, it would violate every bit of tradition in Christian theology.
Let's take a break. We have more to cover with Joe Arlinghaus, and we'll be back right after these important messages.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. We are privileged to have with us a little bit longer Joe Arlinghaus. And one of the things, Joe, I thought we might talk about is, as you point out, the fact that we have what is known as a just war criteria, which is found both in Catholic teaching and Protestant teaching. And we've had this idea that we would love to solve everything diplomatically, but when you are dealing with individuals who are seeking global domination or trying to implement the Third Reich or whatever that particular issue might be, diplomacy only gets you so far. And that's why, in some respects, as much as the Trump administration wanted to come up with some diplomatic solution, they simply were not going to allow Iran to have a nuclear weapon.
Absolutely. You know, there is a long history, which we Protestants and Catholics share, of teaching on when can you attack someone and what are the limits of it. And of course, it primarily starts with the great Augustine of Hippo and his writing on this matter at the end of the Roman Empire. But there is so much, and I think the most important thing that might have been overlooked by a few clerics was this is a duty of the civil authority. This has always been understood. It is not the duty of pastors. It is not the duty of bishops and priests. It is the duty of the civil authority. Now, the leader, the king, the president, he has a great duty before God to make this prudential judgment, right? To figure out what the right thing is. He will be judged for it. And all of these other voices are simply guides or advice. And there's been a long understanding of this. You know, when the Pope spoke a little bit carelessly, I was tempted to, I said out loud to myself, he should go study the Battle of Lepanto, which the Pope himself was the leader of when the Christians of Europe, mostly the Catholics, in 1571, I believe it was, attacked in advance the Mohammedans, as they would have called them, the Ottoman Turks, who were coming to crush Catholicism, Protestantism alike in the 16th century Europe. And there was an understanding, that clear understanding that sometimes you must attack first. It is not true, as some pacifists like to say, that the only war that's allowed is defensive war. Well, why would we have a just war theory if it was only to defending yourself? Who thinks you can't defend yourself? What fool would say you have to let people punch you in the head or stab you or shoot you? Anyway, there is, what I've been happy about, and I'm sure the evangelical world isn't seeing this, but there have been some really powerful theological voices in Catholic America who have come out and spoken. There's University of Texas philosopher Jay Budiszewski, who has written probably the best defense of this and explained just war theory. Probably the most popular Catholic bishop in America is Bishop Robert Barron from Minnesota, who's got a big online ministry. And he has reminded, even though he has defended the Pope some and called for kindness and respect, he has also pointed out what I did about this is a civic authority decision, period, end of story. And of course, who can act? We sit here and we worry about nuclear war and say, well, we can't have just wars in the nuclear age. Well, of course we can, to prevent a nuclear war from these fanatics. I mean, I was 9 years old when they took over our embassy, and maybe it's an emotional reaction, but I don't dislike Islam half as much as I fear the Iranian Islamists. Those Ayatollahs, I think they call it is it 12er Shiism? I think.
Correct.
I mean, those folks really want to take over the world, and
yes.
We need to stop that. And we can't give them the means. We can't even give them a dirty bomb. Forget about a nuclear weapon. They have no business having any enriched uranium.
But again, you mentioned some names. Jay Budiszewski's been on the program with us. Robert George, of course, at Princeton has been here, so we've certainly been able to hear from that. But going back to the conversation we had with, Paul Kinger, we can at least remember a time, and I guess since I'm the older one, maybe I can remember it better even than you, of where you have John Paul II, and you have Ronald Reagan, and you have Margaret Thatcher. And in some respects, I would wish, in the best of all worlds, that the President of the United States and the Pope could bring about some of the kinds of changes that need to take place. And that was a very significant alliance. But if nothing else, I think you've given us a good perspective on what has happened and how to think that through. So if people would like to maybe read more about that, you've given us a couple of ideas of things that we could read if we were wanting to get a little better perspective on that. So what would those be again?
Well, I think the writing of Bishop Robert Barron on just war, which is all over the internet, is worth reading. It is not Catholic proselytism. And of course, that article by Jay Budiszewski, which happens to be in a very Catholic publication called Catholic World Report, is also it's excellent exegesis that Martin Luther would love as much as any Catholic. And I do think we Christians, I know that we Catholics tend to pay a lot more attention to tradition and theologians and so forth, but of course it would be false to pretend that my Protestant brethren do not care about the opinions of great theologians of the past. So I think this just war theory is something we should all really be taking a moment to understand a little bit better, so that we fully understand why this war is just, or at least we study whether we believe it is just. There's a certain place for prudential judgment here, and some of us might. I mean, I'm not terribly happy with war generally, but this may be the war I'm most comfortable with in my lifetime. So, enough said.
Well, again, it's just been great to have you on the program. Again, we do have a booklet that we've made available on the just war theory, as well as a variety of other issues as well. So, Joe, thank you for what you do. Again, I would encourage people to go to your website. We have that link there so they can find out more about Valor America, and that is also very easy to find, valoramerica.org. And if you're wondering what's going to be happening in the midterms, well, some of these very effective outreaches, commercials, and other things come from the work that you and your organization is doing. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
And thank you for all you do, Kerby. Your ministry is a great blessing to the church.
Well, let's see if we can take a break. And when we come back tomorrow, we have a couple of things to cover. The first is our good friend George Barnaby with us, and we're going to be talking about spiritual progress and regress of Gen Z. I think you're really going to appreciate that because he tries to, if you will, show a little bit of encouragement, but let's not overdo that. And we'll find out what we can and can't say and why even when we published a Outlook magazine a couple of months ago, we called it the rumblings of revival, the possibility of that, but let's not overplay it yet, but it gives us maybe some ideas on what we can do as individual Christians and what we can do as the church. Barry McGuire will be with us, and then we'll get into, of course, what's going on in China. We'll talk a little bit more about whether democratic socialists need a new model. That piece by Noah Rothman, I think you already got a preview of that today. And a very good piece coming out by John Stossel about socialism and capitalism. Of course, we have those booklets because we recognize the younger you are, the more likely you are to think socialism is better than capitalism. And that's why we feel that that is a topic we will continually have to address here on Point of View. So if you appreciate what we are providing, some of the interviews we've done today, some of the content we've put on the table, let me encourage you to go to the website. You can click on that button that says donate. If you'd like to listen to it again, you can click on that button that says watch or listen. And most importantly, one more time, I thought I'd mention we are making available Declaration of Independence and Constitution. It's a booklet free of charge. We would certainly encourage you to get a copy of that, and we'd love to send it to you. As always, I want to thank Megan for help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here on Point of View tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Have you ever met a child you knew would do great things? They displayed remarkable imagination, understanding, and a zest for learning. Now imagine someone takes that child and instead of fostering their potential with a real education, they feed them nothing but lies. You know, that scenario isn't so far from reality. From a young age, Americans are fed a consistent stream of distorted facts, from the secular indoctrination they receive in many public schools, to the biases presented as fact in many colleges and universities, to the barrage of misinformation from the mainstream media and the lack of moral grounding in our society. It's not that Americans aren't capable of understanding the truth, it's that they aren't exposed to it enough. You can expose more Americans to the truth when you give to Point of View, where listeners receive facts, perspective, and biblical truth they don't get from society. As long as we have truth, we have hope. Give today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.